When you imagine a medieval castle at night, you might picture romantic feasts lit by candlelight, nobles dancing in great halls, or perhaps guards standing watch on moonlit battlements. The reality was far less glamorous. As the sun disappeared beyond the horizon, medieval castles transformed into cold, dark, slightly terrifying labyrinths where survival meant navigating thick stone corridors with nothing more than a flickering candle or a sputtering torch. Castles were built for defense, not comfort. Those massive stone walls that protected inhabitants from invaders also trapped the cold inside. During winter, the temperature inside a castle could drop so low that water froze in basins overnight. The wind howled through arrow slits and gaps in shutters, and no matter how many fires burned in the hearths, warmth rarely reached the far corners of rooms, let alone the drafty corridors connecting them. As twilight approached, the entire rhythm of castle life shifted. Servants hurried to complete their final tasks before darkness made everything harder. Candles and torches were lit throughout the main living areas, though never enough to banish the shadows completely. The great hall, which buzzed with activity during the day, took on a different character at night. Firelight danced across stone walls, casting long, moving shadows that made the space feel both intimate and unsettling. For the lord and lady of the castle, nightfall meant retreating to their private chambers, usually located in the most defensible part of the structure. These rooms offered slightly more comfort than the rest of the castle, with tapestries hung on walls to block drafts and wooden shutters secured over windows. But even here, luxury was relative. The bed might be draped with fine cloth and piled with furs, but the room itself remained cold enough that breath formed visible clouds in the winter air. Servants faced far grimmer conditions. Most slept in communal areas on thin straw. Mattresses lay directly on stone floors or in tiny chambers tucked into corners of the castle. They huddled together for warmth, sharing threadbare blankets and hoping the night would pass quickly. For them, darkness brought little rest, only a brief respite before another grueling day of labor began at dawn. Guards assigned to night watch drew the shortest straw of all. They paced along battlements and towers, exposed to bitter wind, rain, or snow, straining to see movement in the darkness beyond the castle walls. A torch helped, but it also destroyed night vision and made the guard an easy target. So many chose to stand in darkness, relying on sound more than sight, listening for the creak of armor, the shuffle of feet, or the distant whinny of a horse that might signal approaching danger. Children, too, experienced the castle differently after dark. Noble children might be tucked into beds in chambers near their parents, but even they felt the weight of the night. Shadows seemed to move, drafts whispered through corridors like unseen voices, and in a world where superstition ran deep, it was easy to imagine ghosts, spirits, or worse, lurking just beyond the circle of firelight. This was the medieval castle at night, not a place of romance or splendor, but a fortress where people endured the darkness, clinging to fire, routine, and prayer until the first light of dawn crept over the walls once more. One of the most dramatic shifts that occurred each evening was the ritual of securing the castle. As daylight faded, the entire fortress went into lockdown mode. This wasn't merely symbolic, it was a matter of survival. Castles were built to withstand sieges, raids, and surprise attacks, and nighttime was when enemies most often struck. So every evening, a well-rehearsed sequence of actions transformed the castle from an open, functioning household into a sealed, defensive stronghold. The process began with the gates. Medieval castles typically had at least one massive wooden gate, often reinforced with iron and thick enough to withstand battering rams. As dusk approached, guards checked the hinges, inspected the wood for damage, and ensured the locking mechanisms were functional. Once the final stragglers, usually merchants, travelers, or laborers returning from the fields, passed through, the gates were swung shut with a heavy thud that echoed through the courtyard. But closing the gates was only the beginning. Next came the portcullis, a heavy iron or wooden grille that dropped vertically from above, sliding down grooves carved into the stone. This added another layer of defense, preventing anyone from forcing the main gate open from the outside. The portcullis was operated by a winch system, usually located in a guardhouse above the entrance. Lowering it required strength and coordination, and once it settled into place, it created an imposing barrier that few could breach. In many castles, additional security came from a drawbridge. If the castle was surrounded by a moat or defensive ditch, the drawbridge served as the only access point. Each evening, chains creaked as the bridge was raised, cutting off the last connection between the castle and the outside world. The sound of the drawbridge lifting was a signal to everyone inside that the night had officially begun, and they were now isolated within the walls. Inside the castle, smaller doors and passageways were also secured. Iron bars were slid into place across doorways. Wooden beams were wedged against doors to prevent them from being forced open. Keys to various chambers and storerooms were collected and held by trusted officials, usually the castellan or steward, who controlled access throughout the night. Torches were lit along the walls and in key locations: the gatehouse, the main courtyard, the entrance to the keep. These flames served a dual purpose. They provided light for the guards on duty, and they signaled to anyone outside that the castle was alert and defended. A dark, unlit castle might invite curiosity or attack. A castle glowing with torchlight sent a clear message: we are ready. Once everything was secured, the watch was set. Guards took their positions on the walls, in towers, and at critical choke points within the castle. Their orders were simple: stay alert, report anything unusual, and under no circumstances allow anyone to enter or leave without proper authorization. The night watch was a serious responsibility. A distracted or sleeping guard could mean disaster for everyone inside. For those not assigned to guard duty, the locking of the gates marked the transition into the evening's quieter routines. Families gathered near hearths, servants completed final chores, and throughout the castle, people settled into the reality that until dawn, they were locked in, protected, yes, but also trapped within the cold stone walls. The ritual of securing the castle each night was a reminder of the constant threat medieval people lived under. Safety was never guaranteed. Peace was fragile, and every sunset brought with it the possibility that before morning, those defenses might be tested. The gates weren't just locked, they were fortified with an almost obsessive attention to detail. Medieval people understood that the gate was the weakest point in any castle's defenses. It was the one place where wood, not solid stone, stood between them and the outside world. So they compensated with layers upon layers of security, each one adding precious seconds or minutes that could mean the difference between survival and catastrophe. The main gate itself was a masterpiece of medieval engineering. Constructed from oak beams, often a foot thick or more, these gates were bound together with iron bands that ran horizontally and vertically across their surface. The iron prevented the wood from splitting under the impact of battering rams and made it nearly impossible to chop through with axes. The hinges, massive iron fixtures that could weigh hundreds of pounds, were set deep into the stone walls, designed to support the enormous weight of the gates while allowing them to swing smoothly. But the visible gate was only part of the story. Behind it, wooden bars as thick as a man's torso slid into iron brackets mounted in the stone walls. These bars ran the entire width of the gateway, distributing any impact force across the structure rather than concentrating it on the hinges and locks. Removing these bars in the morning required multiple men working in coordination, a deliberate design choice that prevented a single guard from being forced or bribed into opening the gates. The portcullis added another dimension of security. Unlike the gates, which swung on hinges, the portcullis dropped straight down, its pointed iron or wooden teeth fitting into holes carved in the stone threshold. Once lowered, it couldn't be pushed, pulled, or easily broken. The only way to raise it was from above, using the windlass mechanism in the guardhouse. This mechanism itself was protected, accessible only through a locked door, and operated by men whose loyalty was beyond question. In the most sophisticated castles, the gateway became a kill zone, a deliberate death trap for anyone who managed to breach the outer gate. The passage between the outer and inner gates, called a passage or tunnel, could be anywhere from 20 to 50 feet long. Murder holes, openings in the ceiling of this passage, allowed defenders to drop stones, pour boiling water or heated sand, or shoot arrows down onto attackers trapped below. Side chambers built into the walls of the passage housed guards who could shoot through arrow slits at anyone attempting to force their way through. Some castles featured double or even triple gates, creating multiple choke points that attackers would have to overcome. Each gate had its own portcullis, its own set of bars, its own defenders. Breaking through the first gate might take hours of effort, only to reveal another gate just as strong waiting behind it. The psychological effect was devastating. Even the most determined attackers could lose heart when confronted with such overwhelming defenses. The nightly ritual of securing all these mechanisms was thorough and methodical. Guards tested each lock, checked each bar, and verified that the portcullis dropped smoothly without catching. They examined the gate timbers for any signs of damage, rot, or tampering. They walked the length of the passage looking for loose stones or anything that seemed out of place. This wasn't paranoia, it was practical security in an age when siege warfare was common and the stakes were life or death for everyone inside. Watchmen were posted not just on the walls, but in the gatehouse itself. These guards had the most critical position in the entire castle. They controlled access, monitored the approach to the main entrance, and served as the first line of defense if an attack came. They were typically chosen from among the most trusted and experienced soldiers, men who had proven their loyalty and wouldn't panic in a crisis. Communication between the gatehouse and the rest of the castle was maintained through a system of bells, horns, or speaking tubes, hollow pipes built into the walls that allowed voices to carry from one level to another. If the gatehouse guards spotted something suspicious, they could alert the entire castle within seconds. If they came under attack, reinforcements could be summoned immediately. But even with all these precautions, the gate remained a source of anxiety. Medieval people knew that no defense was perfect. Traders could open gates from within. Clever attackers might disguise themselves as merchants or refugees, gaining entry during the day and then opening the gates after dark. Sappers could dig tunnels beneath the walls, attempting to collapse the gate structure from below. Every night, as the gates were secured, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that vigilance alone stood between the household and disaster. The psychological impact of hearing those gates close each evening cannot be overstated. For some, it brought relief, the comforting knowledge that they were now protected by layers of wood, iron, and stone. For others, particularly those who didn't fully trust their lord or who feared what might happen if siege came, the closing gates felt like a prison sentence. Once locked in, there was no escape until dawn, no matter what happened inside or outside the walls. Children growing up in castles learned early to read the meaning of sounds, the thud of the main gates closing, the rattle of chains as the portcullis descended, the scrape of bars being slid into place. These sounds marked the transition from day to night as surely as the fading light. They signaled that the adult world was taking precautions against dangers children couldn't see, but were taught to fear. Once the castle was locked down and the outer defenses secured, attention turned inward to the heart of the fortress, the Great Hall. During the day, this massive room served as the administrative and social center of castle life. It was where disputes were settled, guests were received, and meals were served. But at night, the Great Hall transformed into something altogether different, a communal sleeping area, a dining room lit only by fire, and a gathering place where the boundaries between social classes softened, if only slightly, in the shared struggle against the cold and darkness. As evening approached, servants worked quickly to prepare the hall for the night. Trestle tables, which had been set up for the evening meal, were cleared of dishes, wiped down, and often dismantled or pushed to the sides to make room. Benches were rearranged, fresh rushes, reeds, or straw were spread across the stone floor to provide a thin layer of insulation and comfort for those who would sleep there. Because the Great Hall wasn't just for nobles and guests, it was a communal space where many members of the household spent the night. Servants, men-at-arms, lesser knights, traveling merchants granted hospitality, and even some of the castle's craftsmen, all bedded down in the Great Hall after the fire burned low. Sleeping in the hall was considered a privilege compared to the cold, drafty corridors or cramped storage rooms where the lowest servants were relegated. The Great Hall itself was an architectural statement. In many castles, it was the largest room in the entire structure, sometimes stretching 50 or even 100 feet in length. High ceilings, supported by wooden beams or stone arches, rose above the floor, creating a vast open space that could accommodate dozens or even hundreds of people. Windows, when they existed, were narrow and placed high in the walls, designed more for ventilation and light during the day than for viewing the landscape. The floor of the Great Hall was usually made of stone, though in some older or poorer castles, packed earth sufficed. Stone was cold, hard, and unforgiving, which is why fresh rushes or straw were spread across it daily. These plant materials provided minimal cushioning, but made a significant difference in comfort. They also absorbed spills, tracked in mud, and other mess, though they were rarely changed as often as hygiene would demand. By the end of a long winter, the bottom layers of rushes could be months old, composting slowly beneath the newer layers. The heart was the focal point of the Great Hall, and in many ways, the heart of the entire castle. Unlike the small fireplaces we're familiar with today, medieval hearths were often massive, open fire pits located in the center of the hall. The fire burned directly on the stone floor, with smoke rising to escape through a hole in the roof or through louvers built into the ceiling. Later castles featured hearths built into walls with chimneys to direct smoke outside, but even these were enormous compared to modern fireplaces. The fire in the Great Hall was never allowed to go out completely. Letting the fire die was considered not just inconvenient, but almost catastrophic. Rekindling a fire from scratch required flint, steel, and tinder, a time-consuming process that wasn't always successful on the first try. So instead, the fire was carefully banked each night, with hot coals buried under a layer of ash to keep them smoldering until morning, when they could be stirred back to life. Maintaining the hall's fire was a responsibility that fell to the lowest servants. Throughout the day and night, someone had to monitor the flames, adding wood when needed, adjusting the logs to ensure even burning, and clearing away ash that accumulated around the fire pit. This was dirty, hot work, and those who did it emerged covered in soot and smelling of smoke. But it was essential work, and everyone in the hall depended on it. The evening meal, supper, was the final major event before the household settled into night routines. This was not the elaborate feast of legend, unless a special occasion warranted it. Most nights, supper was a simpler affair: bread, pottage, roasted or boiled meat if available, cheese, an ale, or weak wine. The quality and quantity of food depended heavily on the season, the wealth of the lord, and recent hunting or harvest success. Pottage deserves special mention because it was the cornerstone of the medieval diet. This thick stew combined whatever ingredients were available, typically grains like barley or oats, root vegetables like turnips, onions, and carrots, and occasionally bits of meat or fish. Pottage simmered in a large cauldron suspended over the fire, sometimes for days at a time, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. It was nutritious, filling, and could stretch to feed many mouths with relatively little cost. Bread in the medieval period came in different qualities. The finest white bread, made from wheat flour, was reserved for the Lord's table. Lesser quality bread, made from barley, rye, or mixed grains, was darker, coarser, and more nutritious, though medieval people didn't understand nutrition in modern terms. The poorest bread sometimes included ground peas, beans, or even tree bark when grain was scarce. Bread served multiple functions. It was eaten, obviously, but thick slices of stale bread called trenchers also served as plates, soaking up juices and sauces before being eaten themselves or given to the poor. Seating at supper reflected the rigid social hierarchy of medieval life. The lord and lady sat at the high table, an elevated platform at one end of the hall that symbolized their authority. Close family members, honored guests, and high-ranking officials joined them there. The high table was often the only table with a tablecloth, and the dishes and cups used there were of higher quality, pewter or even silver, rather than wood or clay. Below the high table, the rest of the household sat at lower tables arranged according to rank. Knights and squires occupied the places of honor closest to the lord. Further down sat household officials, skilled craftsmen, and trusted servants. At the very back, near the doors and farthest from the fire, sat the lowest members of the household. This arrangement wasn't arbitrary, it was a visual representation of the social order, reinforced 3 times a day at every meal. Food was served in order of importance. The high table received the best cuts of meat, the freshest bread, and the finest drink. As the meal worked its way down the hall, quality declined. By the time food reached the back tables, portions were smaller and less appealing. Still, even the humblest members of the household were fed, a point of pride for any lord who wished to maintain loyalty and morale. A lord who let his people go hungry would quickly find himself short of supporters. The serving of food was itself a complex ritual. Pages and servants moved between the kitchen and the hall in a constant stream, carrying platters, refilling cups, and clearing away bones and scraps. Carving meat was a skilled task, and in noble households, a special servant called a carver was responsible for cutting meat at the high table with precise, elegant movements. This wasn't just about dividing the food, it was a performance that demonstrated the household's refinement and organization. Meals were eaten with fingers, knives, and wooden or pewter spoons. Forks were virtually unknown in medieval Europe. The fork as an eating utensil didn't become common until the Renaissance, and even then, it was viewed with suspicion in some places. People used their fingers to pick up pieces of meat, to tear bread, and to eat most solid foods. Liquids and softer foods like pottage were consumed with spoons. Knives were personal possessions that people carried with them, used for cutting food, but also for other daily tasks. Table manners existed, though they were simpler and less rigid than the elaborate etiquette that developed in later centuries. Medieval courtesy books advised diners not to pick their teeth with their knives, not to blow their noses on the tablecloth, not to wipe greasy hands on their clothes, and not to put half-eaten food back on the communal platter. These rules give us a vivid picture of behaviors that apparently needed to be discouraged. Drinking vessels were often shared. A single cup might be passed between 2 or more people at the lower tables, though those at the high table usually had individual cups. Wine was preferred by the nobility when they could afford it, but most people drank ale or beer. Water was available but often avoided because people had learned, through hard experience, that water from rivers or wells could cause illness. They didn't understand the concept of waterborne pathogens, but they recognized the connection between drinking water and getting sick. The evening meal was more than just sustenance. It was a social event that reinforced bonds within the household. This was when news was shared, when the day's events were discussed, when conflicts might be aired or resolved. The Lord used mealtimes to visibly demonstrate his authority and generosity. Guests were welcomed and honored, alliances were acknowledged, and everyone, from the highest knight to the lowest servant, participated in a shared experience that reminded them they were part of something larger than themselves. After the meal, entertainment sometimes followed, depending on the wealth and mood of the household. A traveling minstrel might sing or play a lute, performing songs that ranged from courtly love ballads to bawdy tavern tunes. A jester might perform tricks or tell jokes, though professional jesters were luxuries that only the wealthiest households could afford. Storytelling was common, with people sharing tales of past battles, local legends, or religious parables. Board games and dice were popular, though gambling was technically frowned upon by the church. Men played chess, tables, which was similar to backgammon, or simple dice games, often wagering small amounts of money, food, or favors. These games could become heated, with arguments occasionally erupting over accusations of cheating. The lord or his steward would have to intervene to restore order, reminding everyone that fighting within the hall was strictly forbidden. Music filled the hall more often than formal entertainment. People sang as they worked or relaxed. Popular songs were passed down orally, and everyone knew them. Some were religious, others told stories of heroes and saints, and still others were love songs or seasonal celebrations. The acoustics of the great hall, with its high ceiling and stone walls, amplified voices and instruments, creating a rich sound that must have been one of the few genuine pleasures of medieval life. As the evening wore on and the fire began to burn lower, the energy in the hall gradually dissipated. Conversations quieted, games concluded, People began to yawn and stretch, showing the physical exhaustion that came from long days of manual labor. The transition from active social time to sleep happened gradually, without any formal signal, simply a collective recognition that the day was ending. Servants began preparing the hall for sleep. They checked the fire, adding enough wood to keep it burning through the night, but not so much that it would blaze up dangerously. They adjusted the placement of benches to create more sleeping space. Some people claimed spots close to the fire. Others found corners that offered some protection from drafts. There was an unspoken hierarchy even in sleeping arrangements. Those with higher status got the better spots, closer to warmth and farther from doors. Blankets and cloaks were pulled out from wherever they'd been stored during the day. Most people slept in their clothes, removing at most their outer layers. Getting fully undressed in the cold hall would have been unbearable, so they wrapped themselves as best they could, using their arms as pillows or bunching up clothing to create some cushioning against the hard floor. The rushes on the floor, which provided minimal padding, also trapped heat from the fire and from the bodies lying on them. A room full of sleeping people generated surprising amounts of warmth through body heat alone. This is one reason why communal sleeping was preferred. A person sleeping alone in a cold room faced a miserable, possibly dangerous night. But a hall full of people, all generating heat and sharing the warmth of the central fire, could achieve a temperature that was at least bearable. Dogs were common in medieval halls, and they too bedded down for the night wherever they could find space. They curled up near the fire or alongside their masters, adding their warmth to the communal pool. Cats were less common in great halls, but could be found in kitchens and storage areas where they earned their keep by hunting mice and rats. As people settled into sleep, the hall never became truly silent. Snoring was constant and often loud. People coughed, wheezed, and sometimes cried out in their sleep. Babies, if any were present, woke and fussed during the night. The fire crackled and popped. Somewhere in the darkness, a dog would bark at some real or imagined disturbance. Outside, the wind might howl around the castle walls, or rain might drum against the roof. The darkness in the great hall was never absolute. The fire provided a dim, reddish glow that barely illuminated the nearest figures and left the far reaches of the hall in deep shadow. This darkness was alive with movement, as the fire created shifting patterns of light and shadow on the walls and ceiling. To modern eyes, accustomed to light pollution and electric illumination, the darkness of a medieval night would be almost overwhelming. Sometime during the night, someone would need to tend the fire, adding a log or stirring the coals. This task was assigned to a servant, but sometimes people lying awake would do it themselves rather than wake someone else. The sight of a figure moving through the darkened hall, illuminated only by the faint glow of the fire, must have been both comforting and slightly eerie. Sleep in the great hall was never deep or restful. People woke frequently, shifting position, adjusting their coverings, or simply lying awake for a while before drifting off again. The concept of 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep didn't exist in medieval times. Instead, people experienced segmented sleep, waking in the middle of the night for an hour or more before falling back asleep until dawn. During these wakeful periods, they might pray, think, or simply lie quietly, resting their bodies if not their minds. For many people, particularly the elderly or those suffering from illness or injury, nights in the Grey Hall were times of considerable discomfort. Arthritis, made worse by the cold and damp, caused joints to ache. Old wounds throbbed. Chronic conditions flared. There was no pain relief beyond whatever folk remedies people knew, usually herbal teas or poultices that offered more comfort than actual medical benefit. Despite all the discomfort, the Great Hall offered something important: community. No one faced the night alone. If someone became seriously ill, others would notice and could summon help. If danger threatened, the alarm would be raised quickly with so many people in one place. And perhaps most importantly, the shared experience of enduring the night together created bonds that transcended the rigid social hierarchy. Rich and poor, powerful and powerless, all shivered under the same roof, all depended on the same fire, and all waited together for dawn. The Great Hall at night was medieval life distilled to its essence. Cold, uncomfortable, crowded, and yet somehow also secure, communal, and even intimate. It was a place where the harsh realities of medieval existence were impossible to ignore, but also where people found ways to make those realities bearable through solidarity, routine, and the simple human need to face darkness together rather than alone. While the Great Hall bustled with communal life, other parts of the castle held their own nocturnal rhythms. The kitchens, for example, never truly rested. Even after the evening meal concluded and the last dishes were scraped clean, work continued. Preparations for the next day's meals began almost immediately, a cycle of labor that gave kitchen staff little respite. Medieval castle kitchens were massive, smoky, and overwhelmingly hot. Built separately from the main living quarters whenever possible to reduce the risk of fire, they featured enormous hearths, brick ovens, and open flames that burned throughout the night. Roasting meat for the next day's feast required slow, careful cooking over many hours. Whole pigs, sides of beef, or venison haunches turned on spits, tended by young kitchen boys who fought to stay awake, turning the metal rods at regular intervals to ensure even cooking. These kitchen boys, often orphans or the sons of poor families sent to work for their keep, had one of the most grueling jobs in the entire castle. They sat or stood for hours in the sweltering heat, their faces reddened by the flames, their arms aching from the repetitive motion of turning the spit. Falling asleep meant risking a beating from the head cook, or worse, allowing expensive meat to burn on one side while remaining raw on the other. The smell of roasting meat filled the kitchen, tantalizing and torturous to boys who were often hungry themselves. Bakers worked through the night as well. Bread was the foundation of every meal, consumed by nobles and servants alike, and it had to be fresh. Dough mixed late in the evening was left to rise overnight, then shaped into loaves and baked in the early morning. Hours. The smell of baking bread often served as the castle's alarm clock, signaling to the household that dawn was approaching and another day was about to begin. The baking process itself was an art form that required years of experience to master. The temperature of the ovens had to be judged by eye and feel. There were no thermometers. Too hot, and the bread would burn on the outside while remaining raw inside. Too cool, and it wouldn't rise properly. Bakers developed an almost intuitive sense of heat, testing oven temperature by tossing in a pinch of flour and watching how quickly it darkened, or by holding their hands near the opening and gauging the intensity of the radiating heat. Different types of bread required different baking techniques. Fine white bread for the Lord's table was shaped carefully and baked at moderate heat to achieve a golden crust and soft interior. Coarser breads were baked longer and hotter, creating a harder crust that helped them keep for days rather than hours. Trencher bread, those thick slices used as edible plates, was deliberately baked from day-old dough to make them dense and sturdy enough to hold liquid without dissolving immediately. The kitchen staff included not just cooks and bakers, but also a whole hierarchy of workers. The head cook, often a man of considerable status within the household, supervised everything. Under him were specialized cooks responsible for different types of dishes. Below them were kitchen servants who prepared ingredients, chopped vegetables, plucked fowl, gutted fish, and performed all the tedious preparatory work that made cooking possible. Scullions, the lowest of the low, washed dishes, scrubbed pots, hauled water, and maintained the fires. Their work was endless and thankless, hands permanently reddened and roughened by hot water and harsh scrubbing, backs aching from lifting heavy cauldrons. They represented the invisible labor that kept castle life functioning. No one noticed when the scullions did their jobs well, but everyone noticed immediately if they failed. Water for the kitchens had to be carried from wells or cisterns, often requiring dozens of trips per day. Heating water for cooking, washing, and cleaning required keeping multiple fires going constantly. And all of this created an atmosphere in the kitchen that was simultaneously one of the warmest and one of the most unpleasant places in the entire castle. Hot, smoky, and filled with steam, grease, and the competing smells of cooking food and unwashed workers, the kitchen was bearable only because the alternative, the cold, was worse. Food storage and preservation occupied much of the kitchen staff's attention, especially at night when they had time between preparing and serving meals. The cellars and storage rooms also saw nocturnal activity. Stewards or their assistants checked supplies, ensuring nothing had spoiled, been stolen, or been gnawed by rats. Barrels of ale and wine were inspected. Grains were measured. Salted meats and preserved fish were inventoried. This work was tedious and often done by candlelight in cold, damp spaces, but it was essential. A well-managed castle required constant vigilance over its resources, especially during winter when resupply was difficult or impossible. Meat preservation was a constant concern. Fresh meat spoiled quickly, so most of it had to be preserved through salting, smoking, or pickling. Salted meat was packed in barrels with layers of coarse salt between each piece. This drew out moisture and prevented bacterial growth, but it also made the meat incredibly salty and required soaking in fresh water before cooking. Smoked meat hung in special smokehouses where low, smoldering fires burned for days, infusing the meat with smoke that acted as a preservative. Pickling worked for some foods, particularly fish and vegetables. Items were submerged in brine, vinegar, or wine, creating an acidic environment hostile to spoilage. Pickled foods were often stored in sealed ceramic jars, their contents marked with simple symbols since many people couldn't read. Finding the right jar in a dark storage room required memorizing where different items were kept and hoping no one had moved things around. Theft from the castle stores was a constant concern. Food was valuable and hungry servants or soldiers might be tempted to steal. Locks were used, but keys could be copied or stolen. More effective was the practice of having multiple people witness inventory counts and signing off on any distributions. This created a paper trail, or more accurately, a parchment trail, that made it harder to hide missing supplies. Rats and mice posed an even greater threat than human thieves. These vermin could devastate food stores, contaminating grain, chewing through packaging, and spreading disease. Cats were valued workers in storage areas, though they were never pets in the modern sense. They were working animals, kept because they killed. Rodents, not because anyone wanted to cuddle them. Some castles also used terrier dogs, specially bred for hunting rats, though these tended to be noisy and disruptive. Stables, too, remained active at night. Horses were valuable assets, both as transportation and as symbols of status and military power. Grooms slept near the animals, ready to respond if a horse became agitated, injured, or ill. The sound of hooves, shifting on straw, the occasional whinny, and the warm, pungent smell of manure filled the stables. It wasn't glamorous, but it was vital. A knight's war horse could mean the difference between victory and death in battle, and keeping those animals healthy required round-the-clock care. Horses required enormous amounts of food and water. A large war horse might consume 30 pounds of hay and 15 gallons of water per day. Multiply that by a dozen or more horses, and the logistics of feeding them became significant. Grooms checked water troughs multiple times during the night, breaking ice in winter, or simply ensuring the supply hadn't run low. They distributed hay, cleaned out stalls, and checked each animal for signs of illness or injury. A colicking horse, suffering from digestive problems, could die within hours if not treated. Grooms recognized the signs: restlessness, refusal to eat, lying down and standing up repeatedly, and knew to alert more experienced handlers immediately. Treatments were limited but sometimes effective. Walking the horse to prevent it from rolling and potentially twisting its intestines, offering different types of feed to tempt the appetite, administering herbal remedies that might ease cramping. Success was never guaranteed, but doing nothing meant certain loss of a valuable animal. Farriers, specialists in horseshoeing and hoof care, sometimes worked at night when their schedules were less pressured. The ringing of hammer on anvil as they shaped iron shoes or repaired damaged ones echoed through the castle yard. This was skilled work, requiring an understanding of horse anatomy and behavior. A poorly fitted shoe could lame a horse. A frightened horse could kick a farrier and cause serious injury. So the work proceeded carefully, methodically, with quiet words to keep the animals calm. Chapels within the castle offered a different kind of nighttime atmosphere. Devout lords and ladies might retire to private chapels for evening prayers, seeking divine protection before sleep. Priests or chaplains sometimes held late-night vigils, especially before holy days or during times of crisis. Candles flickered before icons and relics. The murmur of Latin prayers echoed softly against stone walls. For some, the chapel was the only place in the castle that felt peaceful after dark. The chapel served multiple functions beyond simple worship. It was a repository for valuable relics, objects believed to hold divine power. A splinter of the true cross, a vial of saint's blood, a fragment of bone from a holy person. These relics were protected as carefully as any treasure, locked away in ornate containers called reliquaries. People believed these objects could perform miracles, cure diseases, or protect the castle from harm. Religious services punctuated the medieval day at regular intervals. The canonical hours, times for prayer established by the church, included matins in the middle of the night, lauds at dawn, and several others throughout the day. Monks and priests were expected to observe all of these, waking multiple times during the night to pray. In castle chapels, the observance was less rigid, but devout individuals might still rise for nighttime prayers, their quiet devotions a counterpoint to the sleeping household. The chaplain, the priest who served the castle's spiritual needs, occupied an interesting position in the household hierarchy. He was not nobility, but his education and religious authority gave him status above ordinary servants. He advised the Lord on moral and spiritual matters, heard confessions, administered sacraments, and sometimes served as a clerk or scribe, using his literacy to keep records and write letters. At night, the chaplain might be summoned to the bedside of someone seriously ill or injured to administer last rites if death seemed imminent. He would bring holy oil, blessed by a bishop, and perform the sacrament of extreme unction, anointing the dying person and praying for their soul. This was seen as essential for anyone who wanted hope of reaching heaven rather than suffering in purgatory or hell. In contrast to the chapel's quiet spirituality, the armory and guard rooms buzzed with low-level tension. Weapons were checked, sharpened, and oiled. Armor was inspected for damage. Guards rotated through shifts, some heading out to the walls, while others returned to warm themselves briefly by a fire before catching a few hours of sleep. Conversations were muted but constant. Discussions of rumors, sightings, or the ever-present worry about potential threats. The armory held the castle's military equipment, and it was kept under tight control. Swords, spears, axes, bows, arrows, shields, all were inventoried and stored with care. The castle's master-at-arms or his deputies made regular inspections, ensuring nothing was missing and everything was combat-ready. Weapons were valuable, both financially and strategically, and letting them deteriorate or disappear was unthinkable. Sharpening weapons was a task that never ended. Swords and axes dulled with use and required regular attention from skilled workers. The sound of whetstones against metal was a familiar night sound near the armory, a rhythmic scraping that blended with the crackle of fires and murmur of voices. Men took pride in maintaining their weapons. A dull blade could mean defeat in combat, and no warrior wanted to enter battle with inadequate equipment. Armor maintenance was equally important. Mail shirts, constructed from thousands of interlocking iron rings, needed to be kept clean and oiled to prevent rust. This was tedious work, but neglecting it could result in armor that snagged, broke, or simply fell apart at the worst possible moment. Squires, young men training for knighthood, spent hours maintaining their knight's armor, scrubbing away rust with sand, oiling the metal and repairing broken rings. Leather armor, worn by those who couldn't afford metal, required different care. It needed to be kept supple with applications of fat or oil and protected from getting too wet or too dry. Leather that dried out became brittle and cracked. Leather that stayed wet rotted and weakened. Storing it properly in cool, dry places away from vermin required attention and space. Even the castle's privies, crude latrines built into the outer walls, saw use throughout the night. These small, cold chambers featured stone seats with holes that dropped waste directly into moats, rivers, or cesspits far below. They were drafty, unsanitary, and deeply unpleasant, especially in winter. Yet they were a necessity, and people braved them as quickly as possible before hurrying back to the relative warmth of the interior. Medieval castles represent one of the first attempts at indoor plumbing, though calling it plumbing is generous. The privies, also called garderobes, were simply shafts built into the thickness of the castle walls. Some dropped straight down to ground level, creating piles of waste that had to be cleaned out periodically. Others emptied into moats, which made the moats even more disgusting than they already were. A few lucky castles were built next to rivers, allowing waste to be carried away by the current. Privacy in the garderobes was minimal. Most were tiny chambers with just enough room to sit, a wooden seat if you were fortunate, or just a stone ledge if you weren't. No doors in many cases, just a curtain or nothing at all. Using the privy meant exposing yourself to cold drafts that howled up from below, which actually served a practical purpose beyond discomfort. It provided ventilation that made the experience slightly less horrible. Toilet paper didn't exist. People used whatever was available: hay, straw, leaves, moss, or simply their hands, followed by washing in a basin of water. The wealthy might have cloth rags, which could be washed and reused, though one hesitates to imagine the laundry situation. Standards of cleanliness and hygiene were so different from today's that direct comparison becomes difficult. The smell was, unsurprisingly, terrible. Castles reeked of human waste, animal waste, wood smoke, unwashed bodies, rotting food, and various other odors we'd find unbearable. Medieval noses were accustomed to this. They had no choice. Attempts to mask bad smells included burning incense, strewing herbs on floors, and using perfumes for those who could afford them. But mostly, people just accepted that the world smelled bad and learned to ignore it. Throughout all of this, the castle remained a living, breathing organism. It was never truly silent, never fully at rest. Every chamber, every corridor, every shadowy corner held someone working, worrying, or simply trying to survive until morning. The castle at night was not a place of stillness. It was a place of endurance. Footsteps echoed through corridors at all hours. Servants moving between duties. Guards walking their rounds. Someone heading to the privy or the kitchen. In the darkness lit only by occasional torches guttering in wall brackets, these footsteps sounded louder, more ominous. A nervous person might imagine each footfall as a potential threat until a familiar voice called out a greeting. The night sounds of the castle created a kind of ambient symphony. The wind moaning through arrow slits, rain drumming on roof tiles or thatch sections, dogs barking somewhere in the distance, horses shifting in their stalls, the creak of timbers expanding and contracting with temperature changes, the scuffle of rats in the walls, the flutter of bats that roosted in towers and attics. All of this blended into a background noise that residents learned to sleep through, while simultaneously remaining alert for sounds that didn't belong. Bells marked the hours, at least in castles wealthy enough to afford clocks, or disciplined enough to maintain hour candles or water clocks. These time-keeping devices were crude by modern standards, but served their purpose. An hourglass, filled with sand, had to be turned regularly, a task assigned to a servant who then rang a bell to mark the hour. Water clocks worked on the same principle, with water dripping from one container to another, triggering a bell or alarm when a certain level was reached. But most castles lacked such sophistication. Time at night was estimated, felt more than measured. Guards changed shifts based on experience and judgment. When one group felt they'd stood watch long enough, and their replacements were surely. Awake by now, a horn would sound, and the change would occur. Precision wasn't the point. Maintaining continuous vigilance was. High above the great hall, and far from the warmth of the kitchens, the lord and lady's private chambers represented the pinnacle of medieval comfort. Though by modern standards, that comfort remained limited. These rooms were the most secure, the most decorated, and the most carefully maintained spaces in the entire castle. Yet even here, luxury could not fully banish the cold, the darkness, or the ever-present awareness of danger. The Lord's Chamber, often called the Solar, was typically located on an upper floor of the keep, the most defensible part of the castle. Access was restricted. Only trusted servants, family members, and high-ranking officials were permitted to enter. The room itself was smaller than one might expect, but it was richly appointed by medieval standards. Tapestries covered the stone walls, their woven scenes depicting hunts, battles, or religious imagery. These hangings served a practical purpose as well, blocking drafts and adding a thin layer of insulation against the cold. The tapestries themselves were works of art and symbols of wealth. Made from wool, silk, or linen threads, they required months or even years of skilled labor to create. The most elaborate ones told stories, biblical scenes, classical myths, or historical events across multiple panels. During the day, they added color and warmth to otherwise austere stone chambers. At night, they became something stranger, their images seeming to shift and move in the flickering candlelight, giving life to embroidered figures. The centerpiece of the chamber was the bed, an enormous wooden frame draped with heavy curtains. These curtains weren't decorative, they were essential. When drawn closed, they created a smaller, enclosed space that retained body heat, far better than the open room. On the coldest nights, the bed became a fabric cocoon insulating the occupants from the chill. The mattress was stuffed with feathers, wool, or straw, depending on wealth, and piled high with furs, woolen blankets, and linen sheets. Medieval beds were investments, sometimes passed down through generations. The wooden frames were carved and decorated, demonstrating the owner's status. The curtains, called bed hangings, were made from expensive fabrics, wool or silk, sometimes embroidered with family symbols or protective prayers. A full set of bed furnishings could cost as much as a warhorse, making them among the most valuable items in the household. Getting into bed at night required assistance for the nobility. Servants helped their lord and lady undress, removing the multiple layers of clothing that medieval fashion demanded. Outer robes, under tunics, hose, shoes, belts, jewelry, all had to be carefully removed and stored. The process took time and served as a transition ritual, marking the end of the public day and the beginning of private night. Despite all this, sleeping in a medieval castle was rarely comfortable. The stone walls radiated cold. Drafts snuck through gaps around windows and doors. Even with a fire burning in the chamber's hearth, warmth struggled to reach every corner. Frost could form on the inside of windows during deep winter. Breath misted in the air. Getting out of bed in the morning required genuine courage. The lady of the castle often had her own adjacent chamber or shared the solar with her husband. Her space included personal items, mirrors made of polished metal, combs, cosmetics, and devotional objects such as prayer books or rosaries. Ladies spent considerable time in these chambers during the day as well, overseeing household management, embroidery, or private consultations with trusted servants. The lady's chamber was her domain, one of the few spaces where she exercised real authority. She managed the household accounts, supervised the servants, organized the production of clothing and textiles, and maintained the social calendar of the castle. Her chamber served as both office and retreat, a place where she could work without the constant oversight of her husband or other male authorities. Embroidery and textile work occupied many hours. Noble women were expected to be skilled in needlework, creating not just decorative pieces but functional items. Shirts, sheets, altar cloths, banners, all required expert sewing. This work was done by natural light during the day, but planning and preparation could happen at night by candlelight. Several women might work together, sharing the light and warmth of the lady's chamber while their fingers moved in practiced patterns. At night, the couple's attendants slept nearby, usually in small side rooms or on pallets outside the chamber door. These servants were responsible for assisting with undressing, banking the fire, fetching water or wine, and responding to any needs that arose during the night. They slept lightly, always, ready to be summoned. The most trusted of these servants were the lady's maid and the lord's valet, individuals who had served their masters for years and enjoyed positions of significant responsibility. They knew intimate details of their lord and lady's lives, their preferences, their quarrels, their fears. This knowledge gave them a kind of power, though it was power that had to be exercised with extreme caution. Privacy, even for the highest-ranking members of the household, was limited. Servants entered and exited regularly. Conversations could be overheard, and in times of political tension, even the Lord's chamber was not entirely safe. Assassination attempts, though rare, were a real concern. Locks were used, but trust was more valuable than any mechanism. A lord's survival often depended on knowing who was loyal and who might be plotting against him. For the children of noble families, nighttime arrangements varied. Very young children slept with wet nurses or in nurseries, attended by servants. These nurseries were usually located near the lady's chamber, allowing mothers to be summoned quickly if needed. Wet nurses, women hired to breastfeed noble babies, often lived in the castle for years, becoming quasi-family members despite their servant status. Older boys destined for knighthood might sleep in communal areas with squires and men-at-arms, learning discipline and camaraderie. This was part of their training, an introduction to the military life they would eventually lead. They learned to sleep lightly, to wake at signals, to maintain their equipment, and to function with minimal comfort. The transition from the soft beds of childhood to the hard pallets of the barracks was deliberate and sometimes brutal. Girls remained closer to their mothers, taught domestic skills and religious devotion in preparation for future marriages. Their education focused on managing households, basic literacy if they were lucky, and the social graces expected of noble women. Nights were spent learning prayers, listening to religious stories, and occasionally being allowed to watch as their mothers conducted household business. The solar was also a place of intimacy, where husband and wife discussed matters they could not speak of openly in the Great Hall. Finances, alliances, concerns about loyalty, plans for their children's futures. These conversations shaped the direction of the household and, in many cases, the fate of entire regions. A lord might seek his wife's counsel on matters of diplomacy or judgment, recognizing that her perspective offered insights his male advisors couldn't provide. Medieval marriages among the nobility were political arrangements, but that didn't mean they lacked affection. Many couples developed genuine bonds over years of shared responsibility. Others maintained cold, formal relationships, meeting their obligations but seeking emotional connections elsewhere. The private chambers witnessed both extremes, moments of tenderness and episodes of conflict that the public never saw. When the fire burned low and the candles guttered, the lord and lady finally settled into their curtained bed, surrounded by layers of fabric and fur, insulated from the cold stone world outside. Sleep came slowly, if at all. The weight of responsibility, the uncertainty of the times, and the discomfort of medieval life made restful sleep a rare luxury. But for a few hours, within that enclosed space, they were as safe and warm as medieval life allowed. Or at least, they told themselves they were. Because in the medieval world, safety was always relative, always provisional. The thickness of walls, the strength of locks, the loyalty of guards, all of these provided some protection. But ultimate security remained elusive, a goal pursued but never fully achieved. And that knowledge, that awareness of constant vulnerability, colored every moment of medieval life, waking or sleeping. While the lord and lady retreated to their private chambers, the rest of the castle's inhabitants faced far grimmer sleeping arrangements. For servants, soldiers, craftsmen, and lower-ranking household members, nighttime meant finding whatever space and warmth they could, often in conditions that were cold, crowded, and profoundly uncomfortable. Most servants slept in communal spaces. The Great Hall, as mentioned, housed many of them, but others found spots in kitchens, near the dying embers of cooking fires, or in storage rooms stacked with grain sacks and barrels. Some curled up in corridors, wrapped in thin cloaks, using bundled cloth or their own arms as pillows. The stone floors were unforgiving, and even a layer of rushes did little to cushion against the hard surface. Straw mattresses, when available, were thin and lumpy, stuffed with whatever material could be spared. These were rarely washed. Over time, they became homes for fleas, lice, and other parasites. Scratching through the night was common. So was waking up with bites, rashes, or worse. But complaining was pointless. This was simply the reality of medieval life. The infestation of bedding and clothing was so common that people developed strategies for managing it. though elimination was impossible. Servants might take their straw mattresses outside on sunny days, shaking them vigorously to dislodge some of the insects. They might place their sleeping pallets near fires, hoping the heat would drive parasites away. Some used herbs, tucking bundles of pennyroyal, lavender, or wormwood into their bedding, believing these plants repelled fleas and lice. Lice were perhaps the most democratic affliction of medieval life. Rich and poor alike suffered from them. Even nobles, despite their better clothing and living conditions, dealt with lice infestations. The difference was that nobles had servants to help them, running fine-toothed combs through hair, inspecting seams of clothing, and changing linens more frequently. Servants had only each other, picking through one another's hair during rare moments of leisure. Cold was the greatest enemy. Servants owned few possessions: a single woolen tunic, a cloak if they were lucky, and perhaps a pair of worn leather shoes. At night, they wore everything they owned, layering garments for warmth. Huddling together was standard practice. Body heat shared between 2 or 3 people made a significant difference. Sleeping alone was colder and therefore less desirable. This communal sleeping created its own social dynamics. People formed sleeping partnerships, regular companions who shared blankets and body heat night after night. These partnerships sometimes developed into friendships or even romances, though servants had little freedom to act on romantic feelings. Their lives were controlled by their masters, and unauthorized relationships could result in punishment or dismissal. In some castles, servants were assigned specific sleeping quarters, cramped rooms tucked into forgotten corners, under staircases, or within the thick walls themselves. These chambers were dark, airless, and barely large enough to lie down in, but they offered a small measure of privacy and protection from the wind, which made them preferable to open corridors. The smallest of these rooms were called cubicles or cells, and they lived up to their names. A space perhaps 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, with walls of stone and a low ceiling that prevented standing upright. A single straw mattress filled most of the floor. There was no furniture, no decoration, no window, just 4 walls and darkness. Sleeping here meant safety from drafts, but also meant suffocating closeness and the constant awareness of stone pressing in from all sides. Children of servants faced similar conditions, though they were sometimes grouped together in slightly better supervised areas. Childhood in a medieval castle was not a time of play and comfort. By age 7 or 8, most children were working, learning trades, or serving as pages. Their nights were spent alongside adults, absorbing the harsh lessons of medieval survival. Young pages, boys from noble or gentry families sent to serve in another lord's household as part of their education, occupied an interesting middle position. They weren't servants exactly, but they weren't treated as nobility either. They slept in communal chambers with other pages, learning the disciplines of service and the skills they'd need as squires and eventually knights. The pages' duties began early and ended late. They served at meals, carried messages, tended to their lord's personal needs, and ran countless small errands throughout the day. At night, they might be summoned to attend their lord's evening activities, helping him prepare for bed before finally being released to their own rest. By the time they reached their sleeping quarters, exhaustion was their primary sensation. For soldiers and men-at-arms, sleeping arrangements depended on rank. Knights might have small private rooms, or at least a curtained alcove, within the Great Hall. Ordinary soldiers slept in barracks, long rooms lined with simple wooden bunks or straw pallets. These spaces were noisy, smelly, and often filled with the sounds of snoring, coughing, and the occasional argument. The barracks embodied military life in miniature. Equipment hung on walls or lay stacked in corners. Weapons, armor, shields, all within easy reach in case of alarm. The men who slept there were professional soldiers, or at least men who served military functions as part of their obligations to the Lord. They formed tight-knit groups, bound by shared danger and mutual dependence. Gambling was common in the barracks, despite official prohibitions. Men played dice games, wagering their meager pay or personal possessions. These games could become heated, with accusations of cheating leading to fights. Officers tried to maintain discipline, but in the privacy of the barracks, away from the Lord's eyes, enforcement was lax. As long as the gambling didn't interfere with duties or cause serious violence, it was tolerated. Storytelling was another way soldiers passed the time before sleep. Veterans shared tales of past battles, embellishing their exploits with each retelling. Young soldiers listened eagerly, trying to learn what combat was really like, trying to prepare themselves mentally for the violence they might face. These stories served multiple purposes. They built morale, transmitted tactical knowledge, and created shared narratives that bound the group together. Songs were popular as well. Military songs, drinking songs, bawdy songs that would make a priest blush. Men sang together, their voices echoing off stone walls, creating a sense of camaraderie that made the hard life bearable. Some songs were traditional, passed down through generations. Others were improvised, mocking officers or describing recent events. The best songs spread from castle to castle, carried by soldiers who moved between different lords' service. Guards assigned to night watch got no sleep at all during their shifts. They stood on cold battlements, paced along walls, or sat in gate towers, struggling to stay alert. Falling asleep on duty was a serious offense, punishable by flogging or worse. To stay awake, guards talked to each other, sang quietly, or simply endured the discomfort, counting the hours until they could be relieved. Some castles had dedicated guard rooms with small fires where off-duty soldiers could warm themselves between shifts. These rooms became informal gathering spots, places where men shared stories, repaired equipment, or played dice games to pass the time. The camaraderie helped ease the monotony and fear of night watch. The changing of the guard was a ritual unto itself. The relieving guards climbed to their posts, often grumbling about the cold and the early hour. The off-duty guards gratefully descended, their limbs stiff from hours of standing in one position. There was usually a brief exchange of information, any unusual sounds, any movements spotted in the darkness, any orders passed down from superiors. Despite the hardships, there was a certain solidarity among the lower ranks. Everyone understood that survival required cooperation. Sharing a cloak, offering a piece of bread, or keeping watch while a comrade slept for a few extra minutes. These small acts of kindness created bonds that transcended the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. Yet exhaustion was a constant companion. Few people in a medieval castle ever felt fully rested. Sleep was fragile, interrupted by cold, noise, discomfort, or duty. Days blurred together in a cycle of labor, brief rest, and more labor. For most, the promise of sleep was less about comfort and more about simply stopping, even for a few hours, before the relentless demands of castle life resumed. The physical toll of this lifestyle was significant. People aged quickly in the medieval period. A man of 40 looked like a man of 60 by modern standards. Constant labor, poor nutrition, lack of sleep, and exposure to harsh conditions wore bodies down relentlessly. Backs bent from carrying heavy loads, joints ached from cold and damp. Hands became gnarled and scarred from years of manual work. Women servants faced additional burdens. In addition to the general labor expected of all servants, they dealt with menstruation without modern sanitary products, using folded cloths that had to be washed and reused. They risked pregnancy from assault or consensual relationships, knowing that pregnancy would make their work harder and might result in dismissal. They navigated a world where their bodies were considered less valuable than men's, where they were paid less for the same work and had fewer protections under law. Despite all of this, life continued. People formed relationships, found moments of joy, celebrated small victories. A kind word from a superior, an extra portion of food, a warm spot near the fire on a cold night. These tiny comforts took on enormous significance in lives defined by hardship. The bonds formed between servants who endured these conditions together were often deeper than those between family members. They depended on each other absolutely. If one person became too ill to work, others covered their duties, knowing that someday they might need the same help. If someone received an unexpected gift of food, they shared it. If tragedy struck, they mourned together. This web of mutual support was what made medieval service bearable. As the night deepened and most of the castle's inhabitants drifted into uneasy sleep, a select group remained vigilant. The Night Watch. These were the men tasked with protecting the castle during its most vulnerable hours, standing guard on walls, in towers, and at key entry points, their eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. It was cold, lonely, and often terrifying work, but it was absolutely essential. Guards were rotated through shifts, typically lasting 3 to 4 hours. This ensured that no single man stood watch for the entire night, which would have been physically and mentally exhausting. A horn or bell signaled the changing of the guard, a sound that echoed through the castle and briefly roused those sleeping nearby. The off-duty guards hurried to their posts, while those relieved stumbled back toward warmth, their limbs stiff and faces numb from the cold. Standing watch on a medieval castle's battlements was an exercise in endurance. The stone walls provided no shelter from wind, rain, or snow. In winter, temperatures plummeted, ice formed on the parapets. Guards wrapped themselves in cloaks and stamped their feet to keep blood flowing, but the cold always found a way through. Frostbite was a real risk, and more than one guard lost fingers or toes to the brutal conditions. The wind on the battlements could be fierce, especially in castles built on hills or cliff tops. It howled around towers, whistled through crenellations, and cut through clothing with knife-like intensity. Guards learned to position themselves in the most sheltered spots during their shifts, ducking behind merlons when the wind became unbearable, then forcing themselves back to their posts when duty demanded. Visibility at night was poor. Even on clear nights with a full moon, the landscape beyond the castle walls remained shrouded in shadow. On cloudy or moonless nights, darkness was absolute. Torches helped, but they also destroyed the guards' night vision, making it harder to see anything beyond the small circle of flickering light. Many guards chose to stand in darkness, relying on their ears more than their eyes. What were they listening for? The creak of armor, the shuffle of many feet moving together, the jingle of horse tack, the distant murmur of voices. Any sound that didn't belong to the night could signal an approaching threat. Raiders, bandits, enemy soldiers, even wild animals, all posed dangers. A vigilant guard could mean the difference between a peaceful night and a massacre. The sounds of the night became familiar to experienced guards. They learned to distinguish between the natural noises of animals moving through the forest and the purposeful sounds of humans trying to move quietly. They recognized the difference between wind rustling through trees and the more deliberate sound of someone pushing through underbrush. This auditory awareness was a skill developed through countless hours of silent listening. Communication between guards was essential. Towers and wall sections were spaced so that guards could see or hear each other. If one spotted something suspicious, he would signal the others, perhaps by whistle, horn, or simply shouting. Messages could travel quickly along the walls, alerting the entire garrison within moments. Some castles used more sophisticated signaling systems, a series of torches that could be covered and uncovered to send simple coded messages. Bell pulls that rang different patterns to indicate different types of alerts. Even speaking tubes, hollow pipes built into the walls that allowed voices to carry long distances. These systems gave defenders a crucial advantage, allowing them to coordinate their response to threats quickly and efficiently. But the greatest enemy of the Night Watch wasn't raiders or cold. It was boredom. Hours of staring into empty darkness, seeing nothing, hearing nothing, dulled the senses. The mind wandered, eyelids grew heavy. Staying alert required constant effort, mental tricks, pacing, humming songs quietly, or focusing on specific sounds. Guards developed techniques to keep themselves awake. Some counted their paces as they walked patrol routes. Others recited prayers or memorized verses. Many simply focused on the cold, using their discomfort as a tool to maintain alertness. If you're cold enough, sleep becomes difficult, and guards learned to embrace the chill as an ally in their struggle against drowsiness. Falling asleep on duty was a grave offense. Punishments varied but could include flogging, loss of pay, or dismissal from service. In some cases, a guard caught sleeping faced execution, though this extreme penalty was rare. The threat alone, however, was usually enough to keep men upright. The knowledge that your momentary weakness could doom everyone in the castle was a powerful motivator. Guards also had to contend with superstition. Medieval people believed deeply in ghosts, demons, and malevolent spirits. Darkness amplified these fears. Shadows seemed to move, Strange sounds, an owl's cry, the rustle of wind through trees, could be interpreted as supernatural warnings. Many guards carried small charms, crosses, or relics for protection, muttering prayers as they paced the walls. The psychological weight of night watch was considerable. Guards stood alone or in pairs, separated from the warmth and companionship of the interior. They faced outward toward the unknown, while knowing that behind them, everyone they were protecting slept vulnerable and unaware. This responsibility, this knowledge that catastrophe could come at any moment and that they stood as the only barrier against it, created a specific kind of stress. Some guards coped better than others. Veterans who had served for years developed a kind of fatalism, accepting that each night might bring danger but probably wouldn't. Younger guards often struggled more, imagining threats in every shadow, jumping at unexpected sounds. Experience taught discernment, the ability to distinguish between genuine danger and harmless nocturnal activity. Despite the hardships, there was pride in standing watch. These men protected not just the lord and his family, but everyone within the castle walls. Servants, children, craftsmen, all depended on the vigilance of the night watch. When dawn finally broke, and the gates were opened without incident, the guards could take quiet satisfaction in knowing they had done their duty. The first light of dawn was a beautiful sight to guards who had stood through the long night. The eastern sky would begin to pale, stars fading one by one. Birds would start their morning songs. The oppressive darkness that had surrounded them for hours finally began to retreat. Relief washed through exhausted bodies, bringing with it renewed energy for the final stretch of the shift. Morning came slowly. The first pale light crept over the horizon, turning the black sky to grey. The landscape beyond the walls gradually became visible, fields and forests emerging from the darkness. Guards could finally see what they had been listening to all night, usually nothing more threatening than trees swaying in the wind or deer moving through the countryside. The castle itself began to stir. Smoke rose from kitchen chimneys as fires were rekindled. The smell of baking bread drifted through the air. Shutters were thrown open. Voices echoed across courtyards as people woke and began their daily tasks. The castle, which had been a dark fortress through the night, was transforming back into a functioning community. But even as day broke, the night watch couldn't simply abandon their posts. They had to maintain vigilance until officially relieved. The most dangerous time for an attack was often dawn, when defenders might be fatigued from a long night and attackers could use the growing light to their advantage. So guards remained alert, fighting their exhaustion until the day watch arrived to take over. When relief finally came, the night guards descended from the walls with visible relief. Their replacements, the day watch, climbed up refreshed and alert, ready to take over. There was usually a brief exchange of information. Anything to report? Any movement spotted? Any sounds heard? Most nights the answer was nothing, and that was exactly what everyone hoped to hear. The exhausted guards, relieved at last, descended from the walls, heading toward warmth, food, and a few precious hours of sleep before their next shift began. Their eyes ached from straining to see in darkness. Their limbs were stiff from cold and from standing in one position for hours. Their minds were fogged with exhaustion. But they had survived another night. The castle stood, and for now, that was enough. For all its stone walls, iron gates, and armed guards, the medieval castle was never entirely secure. The threat of attack loomed constantly, a shadow that darkened every decision and shaped the routines of daily life. Nighttime, when visibility was poor and defenses were stretched thin, was when castles were most vulnerable. And the people living inside knew it. Medieval warfare was brutal and unpredictable. Rival lords, bandits, invading armies, even local disputes could escalate into violence with little warning. Castles were designed to withstand sieges, but surprise attacks, especially at night, remained a constant danger. A small, determined force could scale walls, breach gates, or exploit weaknesses if the defenders were caught off guard. This fear influenced everything. It dictated how gates were locked, how watches were organized, and how resources were stored. It shaped sleeping arrangements, with the most valuable members of the household placed in the most defensible locations. It even affected the layout of castles themselves, with narrow staircases, murder holes, and hidden passages designed to give defenders every possible advantage. Spiral staircases, a common feature in castle towers, were deliberately designed to favor defenders. They spiraled clockwise as they ascended, which meant that defenders coming down the stairs had their right arms, their sword arms, free to strike. Attackers climbing up had their sword arms pressed against the central pillar, making it difficult to swing weapons effectively. Every architectural choice carried tactical significance. Sieges were the most feared form of attack. An enemy force would surround the castle, cutting off all supply lines and attempting to starve the inhabitants into surrender. Sieges could last weeks or even months. During this time, life inside the castle became increasingly desperate. Food ran out, water became scarce, disease spread through the cramped, unsanitary conditions, and every night brought the possibility of a renewed assault. Castle defenders prepared for sieges by stockpiling supplies. Granaries were kept full, wells were maintained, livestock was brought inside the walls, weapons and ammunition were stored in large quantities. These preparations happened constantly, not just when attack seemed imminent. A well-managed castle maintained siege readiness at all times because attacks often came without warning. During a siege, the night watch took on even greater importance. Attackers often launched assaults under cover of darkness, hoping to catch defenders asleep or inattentive. Ladders would be placed against walls, battering rams would pound gates, flaming arrows might arc through the night sky, aimed at thatched roofs or wooden structures within the castle. Guards had to remain hyper-alert, ready to sound the alarm at the first sign of movement. The defenders' response to a night attack was practiced and rehearsed. At the first sound of alarm, everyone had assigned duties. Soldiers rushed to defensive positions. Servants carried water to extinguish fires. Civilians retreated to the keep or other secure locations. The Lord and his commanders took positions where they could observe the attack and direct the defense. Boiling water, heated sand, or even heated oil could be poured from murder holes or over battlements onto attackers below. Stones were stockpiled along walls, ready to be dropped on anyone attempting to scale them. Archers took positions where they could shoot down at attackers while remaining protected behind stone merlons. Every defender understood their role and executed it without hesitation. Even without a full siege, raids were common. Small groups of armed men might strike quickly, hoping to steal supplies, capture hostages, or simply cause chaos before retreating into the night. These raids were terrifying because they came without warning. One moment, the castle was quiet. The next, shouts and the clash of weapons shattered the stillness. Raiders might target specific parts of the castle. Stables were attractive targets, as horses were valuable and could be driven away quickly. Storerooms offered food and supplies. Sometimes raiders simply wanted to cause terror, setting fires or killing anyone they encountered. The randomness of these attacks made them psychologically devastating even when physical damage was limited. Inside the castle, preparations for potential attack were ongoing. Weapons were kept accessible. Armor was stored where it could be donned quickly. Escape routes were planned, though options were limited. If the outer walls were breached, defenders retreated to the keep, the castle's final stronghold. From there, they could hold out longer, but their chances of survival diminished with each passing hour. The keep was designed as a last refuge, a tower or fortified building within the castle walls that could be defended even if the rest of the castle fell. It typically had its own well, its own supplies, and its own defenses. Thick walls, a reinforced door, and minimal windows made it nearly impregnable. But being forced to retreat to the keep meant that the battle was already largely lost. Civilians, servants, women, children faced particular terror during attacks. They had no weapons, no training, and little hope of defending themselves. Their best option was to hide in cellars, behind locked doors, or in secret chambers, praying that the fighting would end before they were discovered. Medieval castles sometimes had hidden rooms or passages specifically for this purpose, though most did not. The aftermath of a successful assault was often horrific. Castles were looted, everything of value taken. People were killed, captured for ransom, or worse. Women faced sexual violence, a common feature of medieval warfare that historical sources often mentioned only indirectly. but which was undoubtedly widespread. Children might be taken as hostages or sold into slavery. The old and infirm were often simply killed, as having no value. Yet despite these dangers, life inside the castle continued. Fear became normalized, a constant background hum that people learned to live with. Routines provided comfort, rituals offered reassurance, and faith in God, in the Lord's strength, in the thickness of the walls, helped people endure nights when every sound outside felt like a prelude to disaster. When dawn arrived without incident, there was relief. Another night had passed. The castle stood, the people within had survived, and though the threat remained always present, always waiting, for now, they were safe. Until the next sunset brought the cycle of fear and vigilance around once more. In the medieval mind, darkness was more than just the absence of light. It was a realm where the natural and supernatural blurred, where the familiar world gave way to something uncertain and potentially dangerous. Superstition ran deep in medieval culture, shaping how people understood the night and what might be lurking within it. Ghosts were believed to wander after dark. The souls of the dead, especially those who had died violently or without proper burial, were thought to roam the earth, unable to find peace. Castle inhabitants whispered stories of phantom soldiers pacing the battlements, murdered lords haunting the rooms where they were killed, or ghostly women weeping in dark corridors. These weren't just campfire tales. Many people genuinely believed they had seen or heard the dead. The theology of ghosts was complex in medieval Christianity. The church taught that souls went to heaven, hell, or purgatory after death, not that they remained on earth. Yet popular belief insisted that some spirits lingered, either because they had unfinished business or because they were trapped by particularly violent or unjust deaths. Priests might perform exorcisms or blessings to lay troubled spirits to rest, lending official credence to the belief in ghosts. Demons and evil spirits also populated the medieval imagination. The church taught that the devil and his minions were constantly at work, tempting, tormenting, and leading souls astray. Night, when churches were dark and prayers had ceased, was considered a particularly active time for demonic activity. Shadows seemed to move. Strange sounds echoed through empty halls, and in that vulnerable state between waking and sleeping, the mind conjured terrors that felt utterly real. Demons were thought to take many forms. They might appear as animals, black dogs or cats being particularly common manifestations. They might impersonate the dead, appearing as familiar faces to trick the living. Or they might remain invisible, making their presence known only through cold drafts, extinguished candles, or the sensation of being watched. Every unexplained phenomenon could potentially be attributed to demonic interference. To protect against these supernatural threats, medieval people relied on a variety of charms, rituals, and religious objects. Crosses were hung above doorways and beds, serving both as symbols of faith and as barriers against evil. Holy water was sprinkled in corners and along thresholds, creating invisible boundaries that demons supposedly couldn't cross. Prayers were recited before sleep, invoking saints and angels for protection. Specific saints were called upon for specific protections. Saint Michael, the archangel who fought against Satan, was invoked for general protection against evil. Saint Christopher protected travelers, relevant for anyone who had to venture outside the castle at night. Saint Anthony helped find lost objects and also protected against demons. Each saint had their area of specialty, and medieval people were well versed in which saint to call upon for which problem. Even the layout of certain rooms, doors facing specific directions, windows positioned to catch morning light, was influenced by beliefs about warding off evil. East was considered the direction of God and salvation, associated with sunrise and resurrection. West was associated with death and the setting sun. North was cold and evil. South was warm and good. These directional associations influenced how buildings were constructed and how rooms were arranged. Servants and soldiers were especially vulnerable to superstition. Spending nights in dark, empty parts of the castle, they had ample time to imagine what might be hiding in the shadows. Footsteps echoing behind them, a door creaking open on its own, a sudden draft extinguishing a candle. All of these could be interpreted as supernatural occurrences. Some refused to walk certain corridors alone. Others carried small relics or charms, believing these objects offered divine protection. These charms took many forms: a small pouch containing a fragment of a saint's robe, or a sliver of holy bone, a prayer written on parchment and folded into a tiny packet, a cross carved from wood and worn around the neck, blessed medals distributed by priests. Even certain plants, like rowan or St. John's wort, were believed to have protective properties and might be tucked into clothing or hung above doors. Nobility were not immune. Lords and ladies, despite their wealth and education, often shared the same fears. Some employed priests to bless their chambers regularly, performing rituals that involved sprinkling holy water, burning incense, and reciting protective prayers. Others kept relics, fragments of saints' bones, pieces of the true cross, in their private rooms, believing these holy objects would repel evil forces. The power of relics in medieval culture cannot be overstated. These objects were believed to channel divine power, making them extraordinarily valuable. A single bone fragment from a recognized saint could be worth a fortune. Entire pilgrimages were undertaken to visit important relics, and for those lucky enough to own even a small relic, the sense of security it provided was immeasurable. When strange illnesses struck, unexplained accidents occurred, or livestock died mysteriously, supernatural explanations were frequently offered before practical ones. If crops failed, perhaps the land was cursed. If a person suffered nightmares, perhaps they were being tormented by demons. If a child fell ill, perhaps they had been touched by an evil spirit. These explanations weren't ignorance so much as a different framework for understanding causation. Children absorbed these beliefs from an early age. Bedtime often came with warnings: stay in bed, don't wander the halls at night, don't open the door if you hear knocking. These weren't arbitrary rules. They were rooted in genuine fear of what might be encountered in the darkness. Stories of children who disobeyed and were never seen again circulated widely, ensuring compliance. These cautionary tales served multiple purposes. They kept children safe by preventing them from wandering into dangerous areas of the castle. They reinforced parental authority and social hierarchies, and they transmitted cultural beliefs from one generation to the next, ensuring that supernatural worldviews persisted across centuries. Interestingly, these superstitions served practical purposes beyond supernatural protection. They encouraged people to stay in safe, communal areas after dark, reducing the risk of accidents or getting lost in dangerous parts of the castle. They reinforced the authority of the church and the importance of religious observance, and they provided explanations for things that medieval science could not yet understand: mental illness, disease, natural phenomena. Yet for all the fear, there was also comfort in ritual. Knowing that prayers had been said, that crosses hung in the right places, that the castle had been blessed by a priest, allowed people to sleep a little easier. The supernatural might be real, but it could be managed, negotiated with, or at least held at bay until morning. And when morning came, the fears of the night often seemed foolish in daylight. The corridor that had seemed threatening in darkness was just a corridor. The sounds that had suggested ghostly footsteps were just the castle settling, or the wind. The shadows that had moved were just tricks of flickering candlelight. Daylight restored rationality, at least until the next sunset brought the darkness and the fears rushing back. As the darkest hours of the night passed, a subtle shift began. The deep, silent blackness that had blanketed the castle for hours started to thin. It wasn't yet dawn, but it was no longer true night. This liminal time when the world hovered between darkness and light brought a quiet sense of anticipation. The worst was over. Morning was coming. Guards on the walls felt it first. The cold seemed to ease just slightly. The stars began to fade. The horizon, invisible for hours, started to distinguish itself from the sky. Birds, silent through the long night, began their first tentative calls. These small signs, so subtle they might be missed, told the watchmen that their vigil was nearing its end. The pre-dawn hours had their own character, distinct from both night and day. The quality of darkness changed, becoming somehow less oppressive. The air felt different, stirring with the promise of coming warmth, even if that warmth was hours away. For people who had endured the long night, these subtle changes brought psychological relief as powerful as any physical comfort. Inside the castle, the first stirrings of life began. Kitchen staff, who had slept only a few hours, rose to relight fires and begin preparations for the day's first meal. The smell of smoke and baking bread drifted through corridors, a gentle alarm that roused others from sleep. Servants rubbed their eyes, stretched stiff limbs, and reluctantly left whatever warmth they'd managed to find during the night. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was rarely peaceful or refreshing. Most people woke uncomfortable, cold, and still exhausted from inadequate rest. But duty called, tasks waited, and in medieval castle life, there was no such thing as sleeping in, not unless you were the lord or lady, and even they were expected to rise at reasonable hours. The great hall, which had been filled with the sounds of snoring and shifting bodies, gradually came alive. People sat up, coughing, yawning, folding cloaks and blankets. Conversations began in low murmurs. The fire, carefully tended through the night, was stoked back to full. Life and its renewed warmth drew people close like moths to flame. Those who had slept near the fire now moved away to give others access to the warmth. Those who had shivered through the night on the periphery of the hall finally got their turn to thaw frozen hands and feet. This rotation was unspoken but understood, a small gesture of fairness in a world that offered little. In the private chambers, the lord and lady stirred. Servants entered quietly, carrying basins of water, fresh clothing, and reports on the night's events. Had anything unusual occurred? Were all the guards accounted for? Had any messages arrived? These morning briefings, conducted while the nobles were still barely awake, set the tone for the day ahead. The lord's first task each morning was to assess the state of his castle and his domain. Were his people safe? Were supplies adequate? Were there any threats that required immediate attention? This constant vigilance was the price of lordship. The two responsibilities never paused, not even for a full night's sleep. The castle's chapel bell rang for lauds, the first of the day's canonical hours, calling the faithful to morning prayer. This was typically around dawn, though the exact time varied with the season. The sound of the bell reverberated through the stone corridors, a clear signal that the night had officially ended and the day's routines could begin. Priests and monks, if the castle housed any, had likely been awake for some time already, their prayers beginning even earlier in the deepest hours of darkness. The monastic schedule divided the night into watches, with prayers at regular intervals. Matins, the longest of the night offices, was sung in the dead of night, usually around 2 or 3 a.m. For those who followed the full canonical hours, sleep came in fragments scattered between prayer sessions. Slowly, methodically, the castle transformed. Shutters were thrown open, allowing pale morning light to stream into dark rooms. The contrast was striking after hours of dimness. Doors were unbarred. Corridors that had seemed menacing by candlelight now appeared ordinary, even mundane. The supernatural fears of the night retreated with the shadows, though they never disappeared entirely, merely waiting for darkness to return. The sound of shutters being opened echoed throughout the castle, a percussion of wood striking stone as each window was unsealed. Fresh air, cold but clean, rushed into rooms that had been sealed all night. The staleness of enclosed spaces, thick with the smell of too many people sleeping in too little space, was blown away. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. Outside, the changing of the guard took on a different quality. The night watch, exhausted and stiff, descended from the walls with visible relief. Their replacements, the day watch, climbed up refreshed and alert, ready to take over. There was usually a brief exchange of information. Anything to report? Any movement? Spotted? Any sounds heard? Most nights, the answer was nothing, and that was exactly what everyone hoped to hear. But even a quiet night left the guards drained. Hours of standing in cold, maintaining constant alertness, took a toll that went beyond simple physical exhaustion. The mental strain of vigilance, of knowing that catastrophe could arrive at any moment and that you were responsible for detecting it, created a specific kind of fatigue that rest alone couldn't fully heal. The castle gates, sealed so carefully the evening before, were now prepared for opening. This was done with caution, even in times of peace. The first opening of the day was a vulnerable moment. Guards checked the area beyond the gates, looking for signs of trouble. Scouts or early rising servants might be sent out first to ensure the path was clear. Only then would the massive wooden gates swing open, the portcullis raised, and if applicable, the drawbridge lowered. The sound of the gates opening was a powerful psychological marker. It meant freedom of movement was restored, merchants could enter, farmers could bring goods from the fields, messengers could arrive with news. The castle, which had been an island of isolation through the night, was reconnected to the wider world. The first people through the gates were usually farmers from nearby villages, bringing fresh milk, eggs, vegetables, or other produce to sell to the castle kitchens. These early morning transactions were important for both parties. The farmers needed the income, and the castle needed fresh supplies. The exchange happened quickly, goods inspected, prices negotiated, and money or trade goods exchanged. For many inhabitants, breakfast, if it could be called that, was a simple affair. A piece of bread, perhaps dipped in ale or weak beer. Cheese, if available, maybe a bit of cold meat left from the previous night's supper. The wealthy might have a more substantial morning meal, but for most, food was secondary to getting work started. The first meal of the day was not yet the elaborate breakfast of later centuries. For most medieval people, breaking the fast meant exactly that, ending the overnight period without food, with whatever was quick and available. Hot food was rare in the morning. The fires had only just been relit, and there wasn't time to prepare anything elaborate before work began. And work there was endless and demanding. The castle required constant maintenance. Fires needed tending, animals needed feeding, repairs had to be made, messages delivered, accounts tallied, training conducted, meals prepared. Every person in the castle had a role, and as the sun climbed higher, those roles resumed with the familiar rhythm of medieval life. Yet even as daylight banished the physical darkness, the memory of night lingered. Everyone knew that when the sun set again, they would repeat the same rituals, face the same fears, and endure the same discomforts. Night was not an exception to castle life. It was a fundamental part of it, a test of endurance that came every single day without fail. And so the cycle continued, day after day, night after night, season after season, year after year. The medieval castle stood as a monument to human resilience, a testament to the determination of people who lived in a world far harsher than we can easily imagine. They built these massive stone structures not just as fortresses against enemies, but as bastions against the cold, the dark, and the unknown. The people who inhabited these castles, from the highest lord to the lowest servant, shared a common struggle. They all faced the same cold stones, the same drafty corridors, the same long nights filled with discomfort and uncertainty. And they all developed the same strategies for survival, huddling together for warmth, maintaining routines for comfort, and clinging to faith when fear threatened to overwhelm. In our modern world, we've conquered many of the challenges that made medieval nights so difficult. We have electric lights that banish darkness with the flip of a switch. We have heating systems that maintain comfortable temperatures regardless of the weather outside. We have locks, alarms, and communication systems that make us feel secure. We sleep on comfortable mattresses in private rooms, undisturbed by snoring neighbors or the clatter of guards changing shifts. But perhaps we've also lost something that medieval people understood instinctively: the value of community in the face of hardship, the comfort of shared rituals, the strength that comes from enduring difficulty together, the profound relief of seeing another dawn after a long, uncertain night. The medieval castle at night was many things. It was a fortress, a prison, a home, a workplace, and a community all at once. It was a place of fear and faith, of darkness and firelight, of isolation and intimacy. For the people who lived within its walls, night was not something to be enjoyed or celebrated. It was something to be survived, one cold, uncomfortable, fearful hour at a time. The great stone walls that protected them also trapped them. The hierarchy that ordered their society also constrained them. The traditions that gave meaning to their lives also limited their choices. Yet they persisted. Generation after generation, adapting to circumstances we would find unbearable, finding moments of warmth and connection in the coldest, darkest places. When we think of medieval castles today, we often imagine them during daylight, flags flying from towers, knights riding through gates, ladies strolling in gardens. These images are not entirely wrong, but they're incomplete. To truly understand castle life, we must also imagine the nights, the long, cold, dark hours when the castle sealed itself off from the world, when firelight became precious, when every sound carried meaning, and when survival required constant vigilance. We must imagine the servant girl curled on the stone floor of the great hall, shivering despite her cloak, dreaming of spring. The guard on the wall stamping his feet against the cold, scanning darkness for threats that may never come. The lord in his curtained bed, warm but wakeful, worried about harvests, alliances, and the future of his family. The kitchen boy turning a spit over hot coals, fighting sleep while meat roasts slowly for tomorrow's meal. The mother in a small chamber holding her child close, whispering prayers against the shadows. These were real people, living real lives, facing real challenges. They were not so different from us in their hopes and fears, their desire for safety, comfort, and connection. They loved, worried, worked, and dreamed just as we do. But the world they inhabited demanded more of them in ways we can barely comprehend. Every night in a medieval castle was a small test of character, endurance, and faith. And every morning that dawned brought not just light, but victory. Another night survived. Another day earned. Another small triumph in the endless human struggle against darkness, cold, and fear. The castles stand still, many of them, scattered across Europe, their stone walls weathered, but enduring. When you visit one today, warmed by modern heating and lit by electric lights, it's easy to see them as quaint historical monuments, romantic settings for stories of knights and ladies. But if you stand quietly in one of those ancient halls as evening approaches, if you imagine the lights going out and the temperature dropping, if you picture dozens of people settling onto the cold floor to sleep, you might begin to understand what medieval nights were really like. You might feel the weight of those stone walls, built not just for defense, but as barriers against a hostile world. You might sense the vulnerability of depending entirely on fire for warmth and light, knowing that if it went out, darkness and cold would reclaim everything. You might appreciate the courage it took to stand guard through a winter night, or the exhaustion of servants who rose before dawn after sleeping only a few hours on unforgiving stone. The medieval castle at night was a place where human ingenuity confronted natural limitations, where social structures were tested by shared hardship, and where the thin flame of civilization flickered against vast darkness. It was, in many ways, a perfect metaphor for the medieval world itself, a society constantly struggling to maintain order, warmth, and light against forces that threatened to extinguish all three. And yet they persisted. The fires kept burning, the watches stayed vigilant, the gates held firm. Morning always came, bringing with it renewed hope, restored energy, and the determination to face another day. That persistence, that refusal to surrender to darkness and cold and fear, is perhaps the greatest legacy of medieval castle life. So tonight, as you settle into your comfortable bed in your heated home, with electric lights at your fingertips and locks on your doors, spare thought for those medieval souls who faced the night with nothing but fire, faith, and each other. They survived countless dark nights so that we might inherit a world where darkness has been conquered, where cold can be banished, and where night need no longer be feared. The medieval castle at night, cold, dark, uncomfortable, and often frightening, but also a testament to human resilience, communal strength, and the enduring determination to survive and thrive despite every hardship the world could throw at them. It was a place where people learned what mattered most: warmth, safety, community, and the promise of dawn. And perhaps, in our modern comfort, those are lessons worth remembering.